You know how it is in galactic politics. There's always that one species that thinks they're hot stuff. In this particular corner of the Andromeda Spiral, that honor belonged to the Vel'Kari Hegemony, a collection of 8-foot-tall, 6-armed reptilian beings who had spent the last 3 centuries making everyone else's life miserable with their superior tactical doctrine and unmatched fleet coordination. They weren't entirely wrong, mind you. The Vel'Kari had conquered 47 star systems, subjugated 12 different species, and turned space warfare into what could generously be called an art form. Their battle cruisers moved like synchronized swimmers, their fighters swarmed like angry hornets, and their tactical computers could calculate firing solutions faster than most people could sneeze. Admiral Zektar stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Inevitable Conquest, watching his fleet's latest victims struggle against the inevitable. The Rigellian Defense Force, poor bastards, had managed to hold out for almost 6 hours, which was honestly impressive considering they were using ships that looked like someone had welded engines to shopping malls. "Status report," Zektar commanded, his 4 eyes scanning the tactical displays with the casual confidence of someone who had never lost a battle. "The enemy's defensive line is collapsing, Admiral," reported his tactical officer, somehow managing to sound bored while describing the destruction of an entire civilization's military. "Their flagship is requesting terms of surrender." Zektar's scaled lips curled into what passed for a smile among his species. "Tell them we'll consider their surrender, after we've demonstrated why resistance is futile." It was at this moment that Lieutenant Commander Alex Hartwell, currently manning the sensor station aboard the Terran battleship Defiant Probability, chose to speak up from roughly 15,000 kilometers away. "Well, this is depressing," he muttered, watching the Rigellian formation crumble like a house of cards in a hurricane. "Captain, are we actually going to do something about this? Or are we just here for the interstellar equivalent of rubbernecking?" Captain Derek Morrison, and yes, that was his actual call sign from his fighter pilot days, turned from the tactical display with the kind of grin that usually preceded very bad decisions. At 42, Morrison had the weathered look of someone who had spent too many years making the universe's problems his own personal business. "Now, Alex," Morrison said, settling into his command chair with the casual ease of a man about to poke a very large, very angry bear. "When has humanity ever been able to resist sticking our nose into someone else's fight?" "Fair point, sir, though usually we at least pretend to have a good reason." "We do have a good reason." Morrison gestured toward the main screen, where Vel'Kari ships were systematically dismantling the last of the Rigellian resistance. "Those scaled bastards are about to commit genocide, and we're the only ones in range to do anything about it." This was, technically speaking, true. The Defiant Probability was a long-range exploration vessel that had been mapping the outer systems when they'd intercepted the Rigellian distress signals. They were also, unfortunately, just one ship facing what appeared to be half the Vel'Kari fleet. "Sir," interjected Navigation Officer Lisa Wong, because someone had to be the voice of reason, "I feel obligated to point out that we're outnumbered roughly 50 to 1. 53 to 1, actually," corrected Hartwell helpfully. "I counted." Morrison waved dismissively. "Details. Besides, when has being outnumbered ever stopped us before?" "There was that time at Kepler Station," Wong began. "We won that one. And the incident at the Proxima Relay. Also won. Not to mention what happened when we encountered those pirates near—" "Wong." Morrison's voice carried the patient tone of a man who had had this conversation before. "Are you questioning the time-honored human tradition of picking fights with people bigger than us?" Wong considered this for a moment. "No, sir, just making sure we're all clear on the suicidal nature of our next course of action." "Excellent. Hartwell, what's our stealth capability looking like?" Hartwell checked his instruments. "We're running dark and quiet, Captain. The new adaptive camouflage system is working perfectly. To their sensors, we're just another piece of space debris." This was one of humanity's more recent innovations. While other species had focused on building bigger guns and stronger shields, humans had approached the problem of space combat with their usual combination of creativity and mild insanity. The result was ships that could effectively disappear, becoming invisible to most conventional sensors through a combination of advanced materials, energy dampening, and what the engineering manual cheerfully referred to as thermodynamically impossible bullshit. "Good. How long until the Vel'Kari finish mopping up the Rigellians?" "At their current rate of fire, maybe 20 minutes, Hartwell reported. "They're being thorough." Morrison nodded grimly. The Vel'Kari weren't just winning. They were methodically eliminating every trace of Rigellian resistance. This wasn't conquest, it was extermination. "Well then," he said, standing up and smoothing down his uniform. I suppose we'd better introduce ourselves. Chapter 2. The Art of Making New Friends. Admiral Zektar was having what could charitably be called a good day. The Rigellian fleet was down to 3 ships, all of them damaged and running low on ammunition. His own forces had taken minimal casualties, a few dozen fighters lost, 1 cruiser with moderate damage to its forward sections. By any measure, this was a textbook example of Vel'Kari military superiority. Admiral, his communications officer reported. The Rigellian flagship is transmitting unconditional surrender. Acknowledged, Zektar replied, though he made no move to cease fire. The Hegemony had a policy about surrenders. They were inconvenient. It was much easier to simply eliminate potential future problems. Sir, should I relay orders to accept their surrender? Zektar's 4 eyes fixed on his subordinate with the kind of look that suggested career advancement was no longer a concern. Lieutenant, the Hegemony does not negotiate with inferior species. Continue the attack. It was at this moment that every sensor on the bridge began screaming. Contact! The sensor operator shouted, all 6 of his arms working frantically at his console. Unknown vessel, bearing 27 Mark 6, range 12,000 kilometers, and closing. Zektar spun toward the tactical display, his mind already shifting into combat mode. Identification? Unknown, sir. The signature is unusual. I'm not reading any configuration that matches our databases. Show me. The main screen shifted to display what appeared to be absolutely nothing. Then the computer highlighted the outline, and suddenly there was a ship where empty space had been moments before. It was, Zektar had to admit, an impressive piece of engineering. The vessel was roughly 800 meters long, built along clean predatory lines that suggested speed and firepower in equal measure. Its hull was a matte black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and its weapon ports were arranged with a mathematical precision that spoke of serious consideration for optimal firing arcs. Vel'Kari Fleet, came a transmission in accented but clear galactic standard. This is Captain Derek Morrison of the Terran vessel Defiant Probability. You are ordered to cease fire immediately and withdraw from this system. The bridge fell silent. In 3 centuries of conquest, no one had ever simply ordered the Vel'Kari to leave. The concept was so foreign that it took several seconds for anyone to process it. Did that creature just give us an order? Asked the tactical officer, his voice carrying the bewildered tone of someone whose worldview had just been thoroughly challenged. Zektar found his voice first. Open a channel. Channel open, sir. Unknown vessel, this is Admiral Zektar of the Vel'Kari Hegemony. You are interfering with a legitimate military operation. Withdraw immediately or face the consequences. The response came back almost instantly. Admiral, I'm afraid I can't do that. You see, we humans have this annoying habit of objecting when people commit genocide in our general vicinity. Call it a character flaw. Humans? Zektar accessed his tactical database. The search came back empty. I am unfamiliar with your species. Well, that's about to change. You have 30 seconds to begin withdrawing your forces, or we're going to have what my tactical officer likes to call a learning experience. The bridge erupted in what could generously be called laughter, though it sounded more like a pack of hyenas with respiratory issues. The tactical officer was practically wheezing with amusement. Admiral, he gasped between chuckles. Shall I inform this human that he appears to be outnumbered 53-1? Zektar allowed himself a predatory smile. No, Lieutenant, I think a demonstration would be more educational. Meanwhile, aboard the Defiant Probability, Captain Morrison was having his own conversation. Sir, Wong said carefully, they're not withdrawing. I noticed. In fact, they appear to be targeting us with approximately... She paused to check her instruments, all of their weapons. Also noticed. And laughing. They're definitely laughing at us. Morrison nodded absently, watching the Vel'Kari formation begin to shift. It was actually quite beautiful in a terrifying sort of way. The alien ships moved with perfect coordination, each vessel sliding into optimal firing position with mechanical precision. You know, Alex, Morrison said conversationally, I'm starting to think they don't take us seriously. Hartwell looked up from his console. What gave you that idea, sir? The laughing, or the fact that they're arranging themselves into what appears to be a surround and annihilate formation? Probably both. Morrison settled back into his command chair. Well, gentlemen and ladies, I believe it's time we educated our new friends about the fundamental differences between human and Vel'Kari approaches to warfare. And what would those be, sir? Asked Wong. Morrison's grin was the kind that usually preceded explosions. They fight to win, Wong. We fight to make sure the other guy loses. There's a subtle but important distinction. Chapter 3. The subtle art of applied violence. The thing about space combat, Hartwell reflected as he watched 53 enemy ships begin their attack run, is that it's nothing like the movies. There are no dramatic explosions with accompanying sound effects, no fighters dogfighting like atmospheric aircraft, and definitely no time for lengthy philosophical discussions about the nature of warfare. What there is, mostly, is mathematics traveling at relativistic speeds. "All weapons powered and ready, Captain," reported Weapons Officer Lieutenant David Park, who had the distinction of being the only person aboard who seemed genuinely excited about their current predicament. "Defensive systems? Shields at maximum, point defense grid online, emergency maneuvering thrusters primed," answered Chief Engineer Maria Santos from her position at the damage control station. "Though I feel obligated to mention that our shields are designed to handle maybe 3 or 4 capital ship-class weapons, not the approximately 200 that are currently being aimed at us." Duly noted. "Hartwell, what's their formation looking like?" "Classic Vel'Kari battlesphere, sir. They're positioning to hit us from all angles simultaneously. Textbook execution, really. If we were a normal ship, we'd be dead in about 90 seconds. Morrison nodded. "Good thing we're not a normal ship. Park, prepare to engage stealth firing protocols." This was where things got interesting. Most species approached space combat like a gentleman's duel. Ships faced each other, exchanged fire, and the better armed or better armored vessel eventually won. Humans, being humans, had taken one look at this system and decided it was entirely too fair. The result was what military theorists politely called asymmetric warfare doctrine, and what everyone else called cheating. "Stealth firing protocols enabled, sir. We can maintain full camouflage while engaging, but only for about 10 minutes before the energy buildup becomes detectable." 10 minutes should be plenty." Morrison turned to the main screen, where the Vel'Kari fleet was completing its encirclement. "Let's see. 53 ships. What's our current missile inventory?" 240 Shrike-class hunter-killers, sir, each with independent targeting AI and adaptive warheads. Santos looked up from her console. "Captain, the Shrikes are designed for single-target engagement. Even if every missile hits, we're still outnumbered." "True," Morrison agreed, "but that's assuming conventional targeting doctrine." He turned to Park. "Lieutenant, I want you to program all missiles for cluster targeting. 1 missile per ship, but set them to detonate at optimal scatter range." Park's eyes lit up with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for pyrotechnics displays. "Cluster targeting, sir? That's going to be spectacular." "That's the idea. Wong, once we fire, I want you to start dancing. Full evasive maneuvers, maximum G tolerance." "Define dancing, sir." "Pretend you're trying to avoid being hit by 200 energy weapons, while simultaneously making it impossible for their targeting computers to get a lock on us." Wong considered this. "So, normal Thursday afternoon tactics?" "Exactly." Admiral Zektar was feeling confident. His fleet had surrounded the lone human vessel. His weapons were charged, and his tactical computer was reporting a 99.97% probability of victory. The remaining 0.03% was attributed to unknown variables, which was military computer speak for acts of divine intervention. "All ships report ready, Admiral," his tactical officer announced. "Excellent. Target the unknown vessel and prepare to fire on my command." "Sir, should we attempt to disable rather than destroy? We might learn something from their technology." Zektar considered this for approximately half a second. "Lieutenant, we are the Vel'Kari Hegemony. We do not need to learn from inferior species. We eliminate them." "Yes, sir. All ships standing by." Fire. What happened next would later be described in Vel'Kari military academies as the moment our understanding of warfare became obsolete. The remaining Vel'Kari ships, approximately 40 vessels still capable of coordinated action, fired simultaneously, their combined energy output sufficient to vaporize a small moon. The beams converged on the exact spot where the human vessel had been positioned, creating a sphere of destructive energy that briefly outshone the local star. When the energy dissipated, there was nothing left but empty space and the lingering glow of dissipating plasma. "Target destroyed," reported the tactical officer with satisfaction. "Confirmed kill," added the sensor operator. "No debris, no energy signature, complete elimination." Admiral Zektar allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Another victory for the hegemony, another demonstration of Vel'Kari's superiority. He was about to order his fleet to resume eliminating the Rigellian survivors when his sensor operator began making distressed chittering sounds. "Admiral, I'm detecting multiple missile launches." "From where?" I don't know, sir." The missiles appear to be materializing from empty space. On the main screen, warning indicators began appearing as the fleet's sensors detected incoming projectiles. "Lots of incoming projectiles. How many missiles?" Zektar demanded. 240, sir. High-velocity adaptive targeting systems. They're each locked onto a different ship. That's impossible. We destroyed the human vessel. Yes, sir. But the missiles are definitely there. Admiral Zektar stared at the tactical display, watching as 240 points of light streaked toward his fleet. For the first time in his military career, he was genuinely confused. All ships, evasive maneuvers, he ordered. Deploy countermeasures. The Vel'Kari fleet, to their credit, responded with professional efficiency. Ships scattered in all directions, launching clouds of chaff and decoy drones while their point defense systems came online. It was a textbook response to an unexpected missile barrage. Unfortunately, human missiles weren't particularly interested in textbooks. The Shrike-class hunter-killer was the product of what military historians would later call human overcomplification syndrome, where most species built missiles that flew in straight lines and exploded on contact. Humans had decided that missiles should be small, independent spacecraft with their own AI systems, adaptive learning algorithms, and a disturbing enthusiasm for creative problem-solving. Each Shrike analyzed its target, calculated optimal approach vectors, and then proceeded to ignore conventional interception methods with what could charitably be called malicious intelligence. Sir, the sensor operator called out, the missiles are adapting to our countermeasures in real time. They're learning from each attempted interception. Learning? Zektar watched in fascination as one of his destroyers launched a full spread of interceptor missiles, only to see the incoming Shrike literally dance between them, adjusting its flight path with impossible precision. Yes, sir. They appear to be sharing targeting data with each other. Each time we successfully intercept one, the others incorporate our tactics into their own algorithms. It was like fighting a swarm of mechanical wasps that got smarter every time you swatted at them. The first Shrike reached its target, one of Zektar's heavy cruisers, and detonated exactly 50 meters from the ship's hull. The explosion wasn't particularly impressive by military standards, certainly not enough to seriously damage a warship. What was impressive was what happened next. Instead of a single warhead, the Shrike had carried 47 smaller submunitions, each with its own guidance system and specialized payload. They scattered across the cruiser's hull like deadly confetti, seeking out weak points with surgical precision. One found the main sensor array, another located the primary weapons relay, a third punched through the armor around the engine section. Within seconds, the heavy cruiser went from a functioning warship to a drifting hulk. One ship disabled, reported the tactical officer, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. Disabled? Zektar stared at the tactical display. Define disabled. All weapons offline, engines dead, life support failing. The ship is intact, but completely non-functional. Similar reports began flooding in as more Shrikes reached their targets. Ship after ship found itself suddenly and comprehensively crippled. Their crews alive, but their vessels reduced to expensive pieces of space junk. Admiral, the communications officer called out. We're receiving a transmission from the human vessel. The human vessel was destroyed! Apparently not, sir. On the main screen, Captain Morrison's face appeared, looking remarkably cheerful for someone who had supposedly been vaporized moments earlier. Greetings, Admiral Zektar, he said pleasantly. I trust you're enjoying our little demonstration. Impossible, Zektar snarled. We destroyed your ship. Oh, that. Morrison waved dismissively. You destroyed a very sophisticated holographic projection. We've been sitting about 10,000 kilometers away watching the show. Then where are the missiles coming from? Ah, that's the beauty of human military philosophy, Admiral. Why fight fair when you can fight smart? Morrison's expression grew more serious. Those missiles were launched from stealth pods we deployed when we first entered the system. We've been preparing for this conversation for the last 6 hours. Admiral Zektar looked at his tactical display. In the space of 10 minutes, his fleet had been reduced from 53 functional warships to maybe a dozen that still had full capabilities. His remaining ships were scattered across the system, desperately trying to avoid the last few hunter-killer missiles that were still stalking them with mechanical persistence. What do you want? He asked finally. Simple, Morrison replied. You're going to withdraw your fleet from this system immediately. You're going to provide aid to the Rigellian survivors, and you're going to spread the word that this region of space is now under human protection. And if I refuse? Morrison's smile returned, but it wasn't particularly friendly. Admiral, you currently have 12 functional ships left. We have another 400 missiles in reserve, plus a few other surprises I haven't shown you yet. Would you like to see what our main guns can do? Zektar looked around his bridge. His officers were staring at him with the kind of expression usually reserved for natural disasters or tax audits. His fleet, the pride of the Vel'Kari Hegemony, had been systematically dismantled by a single enemy vessel. This is not over, human. No, Morrison agreed. It's not, but I'd suggest you think very carefully about how you want it to continue. Chapter 4. The Art of Negotiation. The aftermath of what historians would later call the Great Embarrassment was, by all accounts, awkward. Admiral Zektar found himself in the novel position of conducting surrender negotiations while his flagship drifted powerless through space, its engines dead, and its weapons systems displaying the electronic equivalent of a persistent cough. Around him, the remains of his once mighty fleet resembled nothing so much as a collection of very expensive paperweights. "Status report," he ordered, though he suspected he wouldn't like the answer. 17 ships completely disabled, 12 with major systems failures, 8 with minor damage, and... His tactical officer paused, consulting his instruments with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for handling live explosives. 1 completely destroyed. Destroyed? Zektar's 4 eyes focused on his subordinate with the intensity of a targeting laser. "I thought the human weapons were designed to disable, not destroy." "Yes, sir. However, the inexorable Vengeance attempted to ram the human vessel after its weapons failed. The ship exploded." "Exploded how?" "According to sensor logs, it struck some sort of defensive barrier approximately 50 meters from the human ship's hull. The barrier appears to have been composed of condensed energy, possibly a localized gravity field. The inexorable Vengeance was compressed into a sphere roughly 3 meters in diameter before the structural integrity field collapsed." Zektar absorbed this information with the stoic resignation of someone whose day had gone from bad to worse to completely surreal. "And the crew? Converted to a fine paste, sir. Very fine. Almost molecular." "Noted." Meanwhile, aboard the Defiant Probability, Captain Morrison was dealing with his own set of problems. Specifically, a crew that was beginning to realize they had just single-handedly demolished one of the galaxy's most feared military forces. "Sir," Lieutenant Wong said carefully, "are we going to discuss the fact that we just declared an entire region of space to be under human protection?" "What about it?" "Well, for starters, we're currently the only human ship within 50 light-years. And technically speaking, we don't actually have the authority to declare anything under human protection." Morrison considered this. "Wong, in your opinion, what's the difference between authority and capability?" "Authority is what your superiors give you. Capability is what you actually have." "Exactly, and right now we have the capability to back up our claims." He gestured toward the tactical display, where the remnants of the Vel'Kari fleet were still dealing with the aftermath of their encounter with human military philosophy. "I'd say that gives us all the authority we need." "The Admiralty is going to have some strong words about this, sir." "They usually do. But they'll have those strong words from a position of strength, because we've just demonstrated that humanity isn't something the galaxy can safely ignore anymore." Chief Engineer Santos looked up from her damage assessment. "Speaking of things the galaxy can't ignore, sir, we've got another problem. That little demonstration drained our power reserves down to about 30%. If another fleet shows up, we're going to be in trouble." "How long to recharge?" "At least 12 hours for full combat capability." Morrison nodded. "Then I suppose we'd better make sure Admiral Zektar understands the importance of cooperation." He opened a communication channel to the Vel'Kari flagship. "Admiral, how are things over there?" Zektar's image appeared on the main screen, looking like someone who had recently discovered that his fundamental understanding of the universe was incorrectly formatted. "Captain Morrison, I assume you're calling to discuss terms?" "Indeed I am. Here's what's going to happen. Your fleet is going to assist in the evacuation and medical treatment of Rigellian survivors. You're going to provide detailed intelligence on Vel'Kari military capabilities to the Rigellian government. And you're going to establish a permanent communication relay to ensure that any future misunderstandings can be resolved diplomatically. And in return, I don't deploy the rest of our arsenal, and you get to go home with most of your ships intact." Zektar's expression suggested he was performing complex calculations involving pride, practicality, and the probability of surviving the next hour. "Captain, you must understand that the hegemony cannot simply abandon 3 centuries of military doctrine because of one engagement." "Admiral," Morrison replied, his tone taking on the patient quality of someone explaining basic physics to a small child. "Let me clarify something for you. This wasn't an engagement. This was a demonstration. We destroyed your fleet using approximately 5% of our available firepower, and we did it while remaining completely invisible to your sensors. 5%, give or take. The point is, your military doctrine just became obsolete. You can either adapt to the new reality, or you can keep fighting and see what happens when we stop being polite about it." There was a long pause as Admiral Zektar contemplated this information. Around him, his bridge crew was very carefully not making eye contact, having reached the collective conclusion that drawing attention to themselves might be hazardous to their continued existence. "What assurance do I have that humanity will honor this agreement?" Zektar asked finally. "You have my word as a Terran officer." "Forgive me, Captain, but I know nothing about Terran honor codes." Morrison smiled, and for the first time since the conversation began, it actually looked genuine. "Admiral, let me tell you about human honor. We keep our promises, especially the inconvenient ones. We protect people who can't protect themselves, even when it's stupid. And we absolutely positively refuse to back down from a fight when we think we're in the right." "And you think you're in the right?" "I think 53 warships attacking 3 crippled vessels constitutes what we call bullying, and humans have never tolerated bullies very well." Zektar looked around his disabled bridge, taking in the dead displays and the acrid smell of burnt electronics. His tactical computer was still functional enough to show him the positions of the surviving Rigellian ships. 3 vessels, badly damaged, barely limping through space with maybe a dozen survivors between them. For 3 centuries, the Vel'Kari had built their reputation on the systematic destruction of anyone who challenged their authority. They were the apex predators of this sector, the final arbiters of who lived and who died among the stars. And they had just been comprehensively defeated by a single ship crewed by a species they'd never heard of, apparently because the humans had objected to what they considered unfair odds. "Very well, Captain Morrison," Zektar said finally. "We will comply with your terms." "Excellent. Oh, and Admiral, one more thing." "Yes?" "When you report this engagement to your superiors, make sure you mention that the Terran Federation is always interested in diplomatic solutions. We're not looking for a fight, but we're prepared for one if necessary." "The Terran Federation?" "That's us. About 8 billion humans, spread across 47 star systems, with a military philosophy based on the principle that violence should be quick, decisive, and absolutely devastating to anyone stupid enough to make it necessary." Admiral Zektar absorbed this information with the growing realization that his species had just encountered something that didn't fit into any of their existing categories. The humans weren't interested in conquest. They'd had the opportunity to destroy his fleet completely and had chosen restraint instead. They weren't interested in territory. They'd declared the system under their protection, but weren't claiming it for themselves. What they seemed to be interested in was making sure that bullies didn't pick on people who couldn't fight back. This was, in Zektar's experience, completely unprecedented. "Captain," he said slowly, "may I ask why you intervened? Your ship was not threatened, your people were not in danger. Why risk your lives for strangers?" Morrison was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "Admiral, let me ask you something in return. If you saw someone beating up a child in an alley, would you walk away?" No, of course not. Same principle, just bigger scales. Humans have this annoying tendency to stick their noses into other people's business when we see something unfair happening. It's gotten us into a lot of trouble over the years, but it's also how we sleep at night." Zektar nodded slowly. In his species-long history of conquest, they had encountered warriors, cowards, merchants, philosophers, and madmen. But they had never encountered anyone quite like these humans, people who would risk everything to protect strangers, not for profit or glory, but simply because they thought it was the right thing to do. It was possibly the most terrifying thing he had ever encountered. Chapter 5. The Long Road Home. 3 days later, Captain Morrison stood in the observation lounge of the Defiant Probability, watching the last of the Vel'Kari fleet disappear into hyperspace. The alien ships had maintained formation discipline even in retreat, which he had to admit was professionally impressive. "Final casualty report, sir," Lieutenant Hartwell announced, joining Morrison at the viewport. "Rigellian survivors successfully evacuated to the medical station at Kepler 7. Estimated recovery time for the wounded is 6 to 8 weeks. And the Vel'Kari? 1 ship destroyed, 16 requiring major repairs before they'll be spaceworthy again. Total crew casualties, approximately 400, mostly from system failures when their ships were disabled." Morrison nodded grimly. 400 dead was still 400 too many, even if they had been trying to commit genocide. Could have been worse. Could have been a lot worse, sir. If we'd used conventional weapons, we would have had to destroy their entire fleet to stop them. That's why we don't use conventional weapons. Morrison turned from the viewport. "Status of our new friends?" "The Rigellians are grateful, sir. They've offered us permanent basing rights in their system, mining concessions, exclusive trading agreements, and what I believe was a formal offer of marriage from their planetary governor." "Please tell me you declined the marriage proposal." "I told them you were already spoken for, sir." "Good thinking. What about our power situation?" "Back up to full combat readiness. Chief Santos says the new fusion reactors are performing better than specifications. She seems almost disappointed that we didn't get to use the antimatter torpedoes. Morrison chuckled. Santos always did love the big explosions. Speaking of which, any word from command? Yes, sir. Admiral Reeves wants a full report, and I quote, explaining exactly how one exploration vessel managed to start a diplomatic incident that's going to reshape the entire sector. Technically, we didn't start the diplomatic incident. We ended it. I don't think the Admiral sees the distinction, sir. Morrison settled into one of the lounge chairs, considering their situation. In the space of a week, the Defiant Probability had gone from a routine mapping mission to becoming the de facto representative of human military power in an entire region of space. It wasn't exactly what he'd signed up for when he'd accepted command of an exploration vessel. On the other hand, it wasn't the worst thing that had ever happened to him. Sir? Hartwell was looking at him with the expression of someone who had more news to deliver. There's something else. Hit me. We've been receiving communications from 17 different species in the surrounding systems. Apparently, word of our little encounter with the Vel'Kari has spread. And? They want to meet us. Formally. Several of them have mentioned something about establishing mutual defense agreements with humanity. Morrison considered this. How many of these species are currently under Vel'Kari occupation or threat? All of them, sir. Ah. Morrison stood up, straightening his uniform. Well, Hartwell, it looks like we're not going home anytime soon. Sir? Think about it. We've got 17 species asking for protection from the Vel'Kari, a region of space that's suddenly very interested in human military technology, and a single ship to represent the entire Terran Federation. We're either about to become very important or very dead. Any preference, sir? Morrison grinned. Hartwell, I've been in the Navy for 20 years. Important and dead aren't mutually exclusive. Over the next several weeks, the Defiant Probability found herself playing host to a parade of alien diplomats, military observers, and what could generously be called intelligence operatives. The ship's conference room, originally designed to accommodate perhaps a dozen humans, was repeatedly reconfigured to handle species ranging from the gaseous Etherians, who required a specialized atmospheric containment field, to the crystalline Zephyrite, who communicated through harmonic resonances and had a tendency to shatter furniture with their excitement. The conversations all followed roughly the same pattern. Expressions of gratitude for humanity's intervention, detailed accounts of Vel'Kari atrocities, and carefully worded requests for military assistance that somehow always ended up sounding like formal treaty proposals. Captain, Wong said during one particularly surreal diplomatic session involving a species that looked like talking trees and insisted on conducting negotiations in iambic pentameter. I'm starting to think we're in over our heads. Morrison watched as Lieutenant Park attempted to explain human weapons technology to a delegation that communicated primarily through interpretive dance. Wong, we passed over our heads about 3 diplomatic incidents ago. At this point, I'm just trying to make sure we don't accidentally start an interstellar war. Start one, sir? I thought we were trying to prevent 17 of them. Details. The truth was, Morrison was beginning to understand that the Defiant Probability had stumbled into something much larger than a simple rescue mission. The Vel'Kari Hegemony had spent centuries building a reputation as the sector's dominant military power, and humanity had just demonstrated that this reputation was based on outdated assumptions about warfare. Every species in the region was now recalculating their strategic positions, and most of them were coming to the same conclusion. The humans represented either a powerful ally or a terrifying enemy, depending on which side of the conflict you found yourself on. Sir, Hartwell announced from his position at the communications station. We're receiving a priority transmission from Admiral Reeves. Morrison sighed. Put it through to my ready room. And tell our interpretive dance friends that we'll have to continue this conversation later. 5 minutes later, Morrison found himself staring at the distinctly unimpressed face of Admiral Rebecca Reeves, commander of the Terran Federation's Third Fleet. Reeves had the kind of expression that suggested she was reconsidering several major life decisions, starting with her choice to join the military. Captain Morrison, she began without preamble, would you care to explain how a routine exploration mission turned into what our intelligence services are calling the most significant shift in regional power dynamics in 3 centuries? Well, Admiral, it's kind of a funny story. I'm not laughing, Captain. Morrison cleared his throat. We encountered a situation where immediate action was required to prevent genocide. We acted according to Terran Federation humanitarian protocols. Humanitarian protocols don't typically involve destroying an entire enemy fleet, Captain. We didn't destroy them, Admiral. We disabled them. Most of their ships are still functional. Most of their ships are currently limping back to Vel'Kari space with their metaphorical tails between their legs, broadcasting warnings about human military capabilities to anyone who'll listen. Morrison considered this. Is that a bad thing? Admiral Reeves was quiet for a long moment. Captain, in the 12 hours since news of your engagement reached Federation space, we've received formal diplomatic inquiries from 47 different species, 3 offers of alliance from regional powers we've never heard of, and what appears to be a marriage proposal from something called the Crystalline Collective. About that marriage proposal, I don't want to know, Captain. What I want to know is whether you have any idea what you've done. Morrison thought about the 17 species currently requesting human protection, the Vel'Kari fleet that had retreated with their understanding of warfare fundamentally challenged, and the Rigellian survivors who were alive because one human ship had decided that genocide was unacceptable. Admiral, I believe we've announced to the galaxy that humanity isn't going to stand by while people commit atrocities. If that causes diplomatic complications, I'd say they're the right kind of complications to have. Reeves's expression softened slightly. Captain, I'm not criticizing your actions. What you did was necessary and probably saved thousands of lives. But you need to understand that you've just made humanity a major player in galactic politics, whether we're ready for it or not. Are we ready for it? That depends. How many more ships like yours does the Federation have? Morrison grinned. Admiral, the Defiant Probability is an exploration vessel. Our combat capabilities are considered modest by Terran military standards. Modest. Yes, ma'am. The real warships are much more impressive. Admiral Reeves closed her eyes briefly. Captain, I'm sending the 3rd Fleet to your position. Try not to conquer any more star systems before we arrive. I'll do my best, Admiral. And Morrison, good work. What you did out there, it's what the Federation stands for. I'm proud of you and your crew. The transmission ended, leaving Morrison alone with his thoughts and the distinct feeling that his life had just become significantly more complicated. Chapter 6. The New Normal. 6 months after what became known as the Vel'Kari incident, Captain Morrison found himself in the rather surreal position of attending a formal diplomatic reception aboard a space station that hadn't existed a week earlier. The Rigellians, it turned out, were remarkably efficient when properly motivated. After their rescue, they had thrown themselves into the construction of what they called the Friendship Station, a massive diplomatic complex positioned at the edge of their system, designed specifically to facilitate meetings between the growing number of species interested in establishing formal relations with humanity. Captain, Lieutenant Hartwell said, adjusting his dress uniform uncomfortably. Remind me again why we're attending a party thrown by people who communicate through bioluminescent skin patterns? Because, Alex, diplomacy is an important part of our job description. And because they've invited 17 different species to meet us, including several we've never encountered before. Right, and the dancing? Morrison looked across the reception hall, where a group of beings that resembled oversized sea anemones were performing what appeared to be a coordinated light show while floating in tanks of specialized atmosphere. I'm told it's a traditional greeting ceremony. It's hypnotic. Don't stare too long. Wong spent 20 minutes watching them yesterday and forgot how to speak standard for 3 hours. The reception was, by any measure, a success. Representatives from the local species had gathered to formally welcome humanity to what they were calling the Free Systems Alliance, a defensive pact designed to provide mutual protection against aggressive expansionist powers like the Vel'Kari Hegemony. It was, Morrison reflected, exactly the kind of political arrangement that would have taken decades to negotiate through normal diplomatic channels. The fact that it had been organized in 6 months was a testament to how thoroughly the Vel'Kari incident had changed the regional balance of power. Captain Morrison, came a familiar voice from behind him. Morrison turned to see Admiral Zektar approaching, looking considerably less imposing than he had during their first encounter. Admiral, Morrison replied, offering a formal nod. I wasn't expecting to see you here. The hegemony has decided that diplomatic engagement is preferable to military confrontation. Zektar replied diplomatically. We are here to discuss the establishment of formal borders and non-aggression protocols. What he meant, Morrison knew, was that the Vel'Kari had spent 6 months analyzing the engagement and had come to the conclusion that fighting humanity was a losing proposition. The arrival of the 3rd Fleet had only reinforced this assessment. 12 of the Federation's most advanced warships, each one individually capable of what the Defiant Probability had accomplished. I'm glad to hear that, Admiral. I think you'll find that humans are much easier to deal with when we're not shooting at each other. Indeed. Captain, may I ask you something? Of course. When we first encountered your vessel, you could have destroyed my entire fleet. Why didn't you? Morrison considered the question. Admiral, humans have a saying. With great power comes great responsibility. We had the capability to eliminate your fleet, but doing so would have accomplished nothing except killing thousands of people. Disabling your ships achieved the same strategic objective without the unnecessary loss of life. Even though we were your enemies, you were people trying to commit genocide. That made you opponents, not enemies. There's a difference. Zektar nodded slowly. I believe I am beginning to understand human military philosophy. Which is? Use the minimum force necessary to achieve your objectives, but be prepared to use overwhelming force if the situation requires it. Morrison smiled. That's not a bad summary. It is efficient and surprisingly merciful for such a militarily capable species. Admiral, let me tell you something about humans. We've spent our entire history fighting each other over resources, territory, religion, and ideology. We've gotten very, very good at warfare, but we've also learned that the best victory is the one that doesn't require a fight. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Ambassador Elena Vasquez, the Federation's newly appointed diplomatic representative to the Free Systems Alliance. Vasquez had the kind of political acumen that made career diplomats nervous, and the sort of smile that suggested she was always 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. Captain, Admiral, she said, joining their conversation with practiced ease. I hope you're both enjoying the reception. Ambassador, Morrison replied. How are the negotiations progressing? Quite well, actually. We've established preliminary frameworks for trade agreements, mutual defense protocols, and cultural exchange programs with 14 species. The Zephyrite want to establish a music conservatory on Earth, and the Rigellians are offering to share their agricultural technology. And the Vel'Kari? Vasquez turned to Admiral Zektar with the kind of diplomatic smile that could cut glass. The Hegemony has expressed interest in establishing formal borders and non-interference agreements. We're optimistic about reaching a mutually beneficial arrangement. What she didn't say, but what everyone understood, was that the Vel'Kari were essentially surrendering their claims to expansion in this region of space, in exchange for being left alone in their existing territory. It was, by historical standards, a remarkably bloodless end to 3 centuries of conquest. If I may say so, Zektar said carefully. Your species has a remarkable talent for diplomacy. Thank you, Admiral. Though I should point out that our diplomatic success is largely due to Captain Morrison's demonstration of our military capabilities. Nothing focuses diplomatic negotiations quite like a clear understanding of the alternatives. Morrison caught the subtle emphasis in her words. The Federation's approach to galactic politics was becoming clear. Speak softly, but carry a very large stick, and make sure everyone understands exactly how large that stick is. Ambassador, he said, any word from Earth about our new status as regional protectors? The President is cautiously optimistic. The Senate is asking pointed questions about operational costs, and the Joint Chiefs are recommending a permanent fleet presence in the sector. Permanent presence? Congratulations, Captain. You're being promoted to Commodore and given command of the 1st Exploration Fleet. Your mission will be to continue mapping the outer systems while maintaining our diplomatic commitments to the Alliance. Morrison absorbed this information with the kind of stunned silence usually reserved for natural disasters or lottery winnings. Ambassador, I'm not sure I'm qualified to command a fleet. Captain, excuse me, Commodore. 6 months ago, you single-handedly prevented a genocide, defeated a superior enemy force, and established the foundation for the most significant diplomatic alliance in human history. I'd say you're more than qualified. Besides, Zektar added with what might have been amusement, your species seems to have a talent for making things up as you go along. I suspect fleet command will suit you. Morrison looked around the reception hall, taking in the sight of 17 different species mingling peacefully, sharing technology and culture and tentative friendship. 6 months ago, most of these people had been living in fear of Vel'Kari expansion. Now they were building something new together, not an empire based on conquest, but an alliance based on mutual respect and shared defense. It wasn't perfect. There would be challenges, misunderstandings, and probably the occasional crisis. But it was a start. Well, he said finally, I suppose stranger things have happened. Name one, Hartwell muttered. Morrison thought about it. I'll get back to you on that. Epilogue, 6 months later. The Defiant Probability hung in space above the newly constructed Alliance headquarters, her hull gleaming with the kind of maintenance attention usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. Around her, 11 other Federation vessels maintained a loose patrol formation, their sensors sweeping the system for any signs of trouble. Commodore Morrison stood on the observation deck of the headquarters station, watching the ships of his fleet conduct their routine operations. It was, he had to admit, a remarkable sight. The first exploration fleet included vessels from 6 different shipyards, representing the latest in Federation military technology. More importantly, it represented something that hadn't existed a year ago: humanity's commitment to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. "Sir?" Lieutenant Wong, now Commander Wong, approached with a data pad and the kind of expression that suggested interesting times ahead. "Priority message from Admiral Reeves." Morrison accepted the pad and read the contents with growing amusement. "Wong, how would you feel about another exploration mission?" "That depends, sir. Are we talking about normal exploration, or the kind that results in diplomatic incidents and fleet commands?" "The latter, probably. The intelligence has identified several systems in the Outer Rim that may be under threat from a species called the Defiant. Look, I'm not saying humans are the most terrifying species in the galaxy. That would be ridiculous. We're the species that invented reality TV, heated debates about circular bread toppings, and somehow convinced ourselves that paying extra for artisanal water was a good investment strategy. Terrifying? Please. But apparently the Zephyrian High Command didn't get that memo. It all started on a Tuesday, which should have been everyone's first red flag. Nothing good ever happens on a Tuesday. Mondays are for existential dread. Wednesdays are for that midweek crisis where you question all your life choices. And Fridays are for pretending you're productive while mentally checking out at 2 p.m. Tuesdays? Tuesdays are for the universe to throw curveballs at you while you're still trying to figure out what day it is. Commander Rick Barnes was having one of those Tuesdays, sitting in his command chair at Outpost Delta 7, watching his tactical display with the enthusiasm of someone monitoring paint dry in real time. Delta 7 wasn't exactly the crown jewel of human military installations. It was more like that weird cousin everyone tolerates at family gatherings. Technically part of the family, but you wouldn't trust it with anything important. The outpost sat on the edge of the Kepler 442 system, officially serving as a strategic monitoring station, an early warning outpost. Unofficially, it was where the Colonial Defense Force sent officers who had somehow managed to irritate just the right people, without quite crossing the line into court-martial territory. Rick fell squarely into the asked too many inconvenient questions during staff meetings category. "Sir," called Lieutenant Danny Morrison from the communications station, his voice carrying that particular tone that suggested the universe was about to demonstrate its sense of humor. "We're receiving an interesting transmission from the Zephyrian fleet." Rick's coffee mug, emblazoned with Galaxy's okayest commander, a gift from his equally exiled crew, paused halfway to his lips. The Zephyrians were one of those alien species that took themselves very seriously indeed. They had tentacles, superior technology, and that insufferable habit of speaking in formal declarations about honor and destiny. Think angry space cephalopods with a superiority complex and access to planet crackers. Define interesting, Morrison. Because last time you said something was interesting, it turned out to be a 2-hour lecture from the Andromedans about proper waste disposal protocols. Morrison's fingers danced across his console, and the main display lit up with the familiar sight of a Zephyrian warfleet. 12 sleek crystalline vessels that looked like someone had crossed a jellyfish with a cathedral and given it delusions of grandeur. Each ship pulsed with that characteristic blue-green bioluminescence that the Zephyrians thought made them look mystical and threatening. Mostly it just made them look like cosmic Christmas decorations with anger management issues. "They're demanding our immediate surrender," Morrison reported, trying very hard to keep a straight face. "Something about, violating the sacred boundaries of Zephyrian space, and committing acts of unprecedented aggression against the children of the deep currents." Rick set down his mug with deliberate care. "We're violating their space? We've been sitting in the exact same spot for 3 years. Hell, we sent them a gift basket when we first set up shop." "The gift basket might have been the problem, sir," offered Chief Petty Officer Lisa Kowalski from the engineering station. She was the kind of person who could fix a quantum reactor with a paper clip and sheer bloody-mindedness, but had absolutely zero filter when it came to stating uncomfortable truths. Remember how they said receiving unsolicited organic matter was tantamount to a biological warfare threat? That was one exotic tropical sphere, Rick said flatly. One yellow spiky thing, with a card that said "Welcome to the Neighborhood." A weaponized tropical sphere, according to their cultural attaché. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on anyone present. Here they were, potentially about to be vaporized by beings who considered organic gift delivery a war crime. It was exactly the kind of cosmic joke that made Rick wonder if the universe had a twisted sense of humor, or if he'd somehow offended a minor deity in a past life. The communications array crackled to life, and the main screen shifted to show the interior of a Zephyrian command vessel. The being that appeared looked like what would happen if an octopus had decided to cosplay as a Victorian gentleman and gotten really angry about it. Tentacles writhed in what Rick had learned was the Zephyrian equivalent of dramatic gesturing, while chromatic displays flashed across its translucent skin in colors that probably had deep cultural significance but mostly just looked like a bad acid trip. "I am Fleet Sovereign Kethvar of the Third Deep Current," the creature announced in that peculiar harmonic voice that all Zephyrians seem to possess. It sounded like a church organ being played underwater by someone having an existential crisis. "You have been judged wanting by the eternal tides. Your presence here is an affront to the sanctity of—" "Yeah, hi there, Keth," Rick interrupted, causing several of his crew members to make quiet choking sounds. Interrupting a Zephyrian mid-monologue was considered roughly equivalent to setting fire to a library while insulting someone's mother. "Look, I'm sure you've got a whole speech prepared about tides and currents and whatever, but could we maybe skip to the part where you tell me what's actually got your tentacles in a twist?" The silence that followed was so profound that Rick was pretty sure he could hear the cosmic background radiation. Kethvar's light displays shifted through several colors that definitely weren't in any diplomatic handbook. "You dare to address a fleet sovereign with such casual— Buddy, I've been sitting in this tin can for 3 years watching absolutely nothing happen. My entertainment options consist of Morrison's collection of ancient Earth sitcoms and Kowalski's increasingly creative profanity. So yeah, I'm going to cut through the ceremonial BS and ask what the hell you want." Morrison was making frantic hand gestures that Rick interpreted as either "stop talking" or "we're all going to die." But at this point, the universe had clearly decided that subtlety was off the menu. Kethvar's tentacles performed what could charitably be called a dramatic flourish. "Your species has committed the ultimate transgression. You have... Spit it out, Keth. You have made jokes about us." The entire bridge went dead silent. Rick blinked. Morrison blinked. Even the various displays seemed to dim slightly, as if the universe itself was processing this information. "I'm sorry," Rick said slowly. "You're threatening to blow us up because someone made fun of you?" "Not just someone." Kethvar's chromatic shifts were now cycling through colors that Rick was pretty sure meant apocalyptically offended. "Your entertainment media, your comedy shows, they portray the noble Zephyrian people as what? As space cephalopods with superiority complexes." There was another moment of profound silence. Rick glanced at Morrison, who was clearly struggling not to laugh. Kowalski had given up all pretense and was grinning openly. "Well," Rick said carefully, "I mean, aren't you?" If Zephyrians could have aneurysms, Kethvar probably would have had one right then and there. Instead, his light patterns exploded into what could only be described as the optical equivalent of a primal scream. "Enough! The insult will be answered. You will surrender immediately, or face the consequences." Rick leaned back in his command chair, mentally calculating their options. Delta 7 had defensive capabilities, sure, but they were designed more for politely discouraging pirates than facing down an entire Zephyrian battle fleet. Their shields could probably handle a few shots, maybe buy them enough time to send out a distress call that someone might receive in a few hours. Maybe. On the other hand— "Morrison," Rick said quietly, "are we still broadcasting on the general emergency frequency?" "Yes, sir. Wide band, full spectrum. Anyone within about 50 light-years should be picking this up." Rick nodded slowly, a plan forming in his mind. It wasn't a good plan. It probably wasn't even a sane plan. But it was Tuesday, he was already having a bad day, and sometimes the universe demanded that you commit to the bit. "Kethvar," he said, leaning forward in his chair, "let me ask you something. How many ships do you have there?" 12 vessels of the Third Deep Current Fleet, each capable of reducing your pathetic outpost to constituent atoms. "Uh-huh. And how many humans are on this station?" Kethvar's tentacles waved dismissively. "What relevance does this have? You are outnumbered, outgunned, and— humor me." There was a pause, as presumably someone on the Zephyrian flagship ran some scans. 47 life signs detected. 47, Rick repeated. "So just to be clear, you brought 12 military vessels and— what's your crew complement there? About 300 per ship? 347 per vessel, plus command staff." Rick started grinning. It wasn't a nice grin. It was the kind of grin that made Morrison start backing slowly away from the command station. So you brought roughly 4,000 Zephyrians to deal with 47 humans. Your point being? My point, Keth, is that you just made the most embarrassing tactical admission in galactic history on a wideband emergency frequency that everyone in 50 light-years is currently listening to. The silence stretched out like a rubber band about to snap. Rick could practically hear the gears turning in Keth Var's head as the implications sank in. 4,000 to 47, Rick continued conversationally. That's about, 85 to 1 odds? And you felt like you needed those odds to take on one undermanned research station. That's either the most paranoid military assessment in history or what? Keth Var's voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper. Or you know something about humans that you're not sharing with the class. Morrison was now making gestures that definitely meant, oh God, we're all going to die. But Rick was committed now. He'd started down this path, and sometimes you just had to see where the rabbit hole led. I mean, think about it from our perspective, Rick continued, warming to his theme. Either you're so incompetent that you need overwhelming numerical superiority to handle a routine arrest, or you're so terrified of humans that you won't engage us without a massive advantage. Either way, it's not a great look for the mighty Zephyrian fleet. Keth Var's chromatic displays had now shifted to colors that Rick was pretty sure meant homicidal rage. But he was in too deep to stop now. So which is it, Keth? Are you incompetent or scared? What happened next would later be studied in military academies across the galaxy as either a masterpiece of psychological warfare or the luckiest bluff in recorded history, depending on who you asked. Keth Var let out a sound that was part roar, part static, and part the noise a garbage disposal makes when you accidentally drop a spoon into it. The screen flickered as his tentacles apparently hit several control surfaces at once. "Fire all missiles!" he shrieked. "Reduce that arrogant pest to cosmic dust!" Rick's grin didn't waver, even as his crew started frantically preparing for impact. "Morrison, make sure you're still broadcasting. I want everyone to hear this." "Sir, with all due respect," Morrison said, his voice cracking slightly. "We're about to be blown up. Maybe this isn't the time for... Trust me on this one." The tactical display lit up like a Christmas tree as 12 Zephyrian vessels launched their full complement of quantum torpedoes. 72 missiles, each one capable of cracking a small moon, streaked toward their tiny outpost. Rick watched them approach with the sort of calm that comes from either complete confidence or complete resignation to fate. "Kowalski, shields up. Morrison, keep that channel open." "Shields are up, sir, but they won't hold against that kind of firepower." "They don't need to hold. They just need to make a point." The missiles impacted Delta 7's shields in a cascade of brilliant explosions that turned the local space into a miniature star. The outpost shook like a paint mixer having a seizure. Lights flickered, and several console displays went dark. But when the light show finally faded, the station was still there. Battered, smoking slightly, and with what was probably going to be a very expensive repair bill, but still very much intact. The silence that followed was the kind of profound quiet that usually preceded either enlightenment or complete mental breakdown. "Well," Rick said into the stunned quiet, "that was embarrassing." On the main screen, Keth Var was staring at his tactical displays with the expression of someone who had just discovered that his calculator had been giving him wrong answers for the past 20 years. "Impossible," he whispered. 72 quantum torpedoes. Direct hits. You should be... How are you still?" Rick leaned back in his command chair, trying very hard not to let his relief show. Truth was, he hadn't been entirely sure the plan would work either. "Oh, that? Yeah, funny story. See, we've been sitting out here for 3 years with absolutely nothing to do except tinker with our equipment. And Kowalski here..." He gestured to his chief engineer, who was now grinning like a cat who had not only gotten the cream, but had also figured out how to open the refrigerator. "She's got this thing about making improvements." "Improvements?" Keth Var's voice had the hollow quality of someone whose worldview was currently being fed through a wood chipper. "Oh yeah. See, the standard Mark 7 defensive grid is rated for what, maybe a dozen torpedo impacts? But when you've got 3 years and a chief engineer who gets bored easily..." Rick shrugged. "Let's just say our shields aren't exactly standard anymore." Kowalski stood up and took a theatrical bow. "I may have made a few modifications. Redundant power couplings, enhanced field generators, some creative rewiring that technically violates about 14 different safety protocols." "How many impacts can you handle?" The question came out as barely a whisper. "Well, we just took 72, and we're still here, so... more than that." Rick could practically see Keth Var's brain trying to process this information. Here he was, the fleet sovereign of the Third Deep Current, commanding 12 of the most advanced warships in Zephyrian space, and he'd just failed to destroy a single human outpost defended by 47 people and an engineer with too much time on her hands. But Rick wasn't done yet. You know what the really funny part is, Keth? You were right to be scared. What? Oh, not because we're some kind of super warriors or anything. Hell, half my crew is here because we annoyed our superiors. Morrison over there once got written up for excessive sarcasm in official reports. Kowalski got transferred after she accidentally caused a diplomatic incident by rebuilding an ambassador's shuttlecraft without permission. Then why? Rick's grin widened. Because we're bored, Keth. Do you have any idea what happens when you put 47 humans in a tin can in deep space for 3 years with nothing to shoot at? We start getting creative. And creative humans are absolutely terrifying. He gestured to the tactical display, where the Zephyrian fleet was still hanging in space, apparently unsure what to do next. I mean, take our weapons systems. Standard armament for an outpost this size is maybe 2 defensive turrets and a single torpedo tube. Wanna guess what we've got now? Kethvar remained silent, but his light displays were now cycling through colors that Rick was starting to recognize as existential dread. Morrison, bring up the weapons grid. The tactical display shifted, and suddenly the space around Delta 7 was filled with targeting indicators. Dozens of them. Missile batteries that had been disguised as communication arrays. Energy weapons built into what looked like sensor platforms. Torpedo tubes hidden behind false hull plating. Kowalski's been busy, Rick said conversationally. 3 years of routine maintenance and equipment upgrades. Amazing what you can accomplish when nobody's watching too closely. This is impossible, Kethvar said, but his voice lacked conviction. Your outpost is a research station. You don't have the resources to build a fortress disguised as a research station? Yeah, you'd think that, wouldn't you? But here's the thing about humans, Keth. We're really, really good at making do with what we have. And when we're bored, we get creative. Rick stood up from his command chair and walked over to the main display, where Kethvar's image was still staring at the tactical readout with the expression of someone who had just realized he'd brought a knife to a gunfight, only to discover that the other guy had somehow turned his knife into a flamethrower. So here's where we stand, Rick continued. You've got 12 ships, we've got 1 station. But our 1 station just shrugged off your best shot, and we've got enough firepower to turn your entire fleet into very expensive scrap metal. Plus, and this is the important part, everyone within 50 light years just heard you fail to destroy a single human outpost with overwhelming force. The implications were sinking in, and Rick could see the exact moment when Kethvar realized just how badly he'd screwed up. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was a public relations catastrophe of galactic proportions. The other thing about humans, Rick said, his voice dropping to a conversational tone that somehow made his words more threatening, is that we really don't like bullies. And you, Keth, just broadcast to half the galaxy that you're the kind of species that brings overwhelming force to bear on people who can't fight back. Except we could fight back, Morrison added helpfully. Right, except we could fight back, which makes you both bullies and incompetent. That's not a good combination. Kethvar's tentacles were now writhing in patterns that Rick was pretty sure indicated complete emotional breakdown. This was not... We were told that human installations were poorly defended. Our intelligence indicated. Your intelligence was wrong, Rick stated simply. The question now is, what are you going to do about it? There was a long pause as Kethvar presumably conferred with his officers. Rick used the time to check their actual tactical situation, which was considerably less rosy than he'd been making it sound. Sure, they'd survived the missile barrage, but their shields were down to about 30%. Half their newly installed weapons were showing stress fractures, and Kowalski was making the kind of faces that suggested expensive repairs were in their immediate future. But Kethvar didn't need to know that. Commander Barnes, Kethvar said finally, his voice formal and stilted. The 3rd Deep Current Fleet withdraws. This engagement was based on flawed intelligence. Smart choice, Rick replied. But before you go, I've got a proposition for you. Proposition? Rick walked back to his command chair and sat down, trying to project an air of casual confidence. See, here's the thing. You've got a problem now. Everyone in the galaxy just heard you get your tentacles handed to you by 47 humans in a converted research station. That's going to hurt your reputation. Your point? My point is that reputations can be rebuilt, with the right story. Kethvar's chromatic patterns shifted to colors that Rick was learning to recognize as cautious interest. What kind of story? Rick leaned forward in his chair. The kind where the mighty Zephyrian fleet encountered a heavily fortified human stronghold, and, after a brief but intense engagement, decided that discretion was the better part of valor. where cooler heads prevailed and a potentially devastating conflict was avoided through skilled diplomacy. You would agree to such a narrative? I would agree to not mention that you brought 4,000 warriors to arrest 47 humans, yes, in exchange for a few considerations. Such as? Rick's grin was back, but this time it was the grin of someone who had just figured out how to turn a potential disaster into a win-win situation. First, the Zephyrian fleet formally recognizes the sovereignty of human space and agrees to respect our territorial boundaries. No more sacred space nonsense. Kethvar's tentacles twitched, but he nodded. Second, you spread the word that human installations are not to be trifled with. We're peaceful, but we're not pushovers. Another nod. And third, Rick's grin widened, you issue a formal apology for the gift basket incident. That exotic sphere was a gesture of friendship, and your people treated it like a war crime. That hurt our feelings. There was another long pause. Then, incredibly, Kethvar began to make a sound that Rick eventually realized was laughter. It sounded like a whale having hiccups, but it was definitely laughter. Commander Barnes, Kethvar said when he'd recovered. I believe I understand now why our intelligence was so thoroughly wrong about human installations. Oh? They were not wrong about your defenses. They were wrong about your creativity. Rick nodded. We're a creative species, Keth. Sometimes that works out well for everyone involved. And sometimes, Morrison added quietly, it results in things like reality TV and heated debates about circular bread toppings. Nobody's perfect, Rick said philosophically. Over the next hour, Rick found himself engaged in what was probably the most surreal diplomatic negotiation of his career. Kethvar, it turned out, was actually quite reasonable once you got past the formal pronouncements and wounded dignity. The Zephyrians had genuinely believed that human outposts were lightly defended research stations, and the intelligence failure that led to their misconception was apparently rooted in the fact that most species didn't spend their spare time turning research stations into fortress complexes. It is not a concept that translates well to Zephyrian thinking, Kethvar explained. When we establish a research outpost, it remains a research outpost. We do not improvise. Different approaches to problem solving. Rick agreed diplomatically. We tend to be more adaptive. Adaptive. Kethvar repeated the word like he was tasting it. Yes, I can see how that would be advantageous. By the time they finished hammering out the details, Rick had managed to negotiate not just a withdrawal of the Zephyrian fleet, but also a mutual defense pact, a trade agreement, and somehow, a cultural exchange program that would allow human comedians to perform for Zephyrian audiences, provided they stuck to approved topics that didn't involve tentacles or superiority complexes. I believe, Kethvar said as they concluded their negotiations, that this engagement will be remembered as the beginning of a new era of human-Zephyrian relations. Here's hoping, Rick responded. And Keth, next time you want to visit, maybe try calling ahead. We'll prepare a proper reception. A proper reception? It's a human custom. Formal welcomes and diplomatic protocols. You'll love it. After the Zephyrian fleet had departed, Rick found himself alone on the bridge except for Morrison, who was still monitoring the communications array with the dedication of someone who had just witnessed history being made. Sir, Morrison said eventually. Yeah? That was either the most brilliant piece of improvised diplomacy in human history, or the luckiest bluff ever attempted. Rick considered this. Probably both. But here's the thing, Morrison. Sometimes the universe puts you in a situation where your only choice is to commit to the bit and see what happens. And if it hadn't worked? Rick shrugged. Then we'd have gone out in a blaze of glory and hopefully given the next human outpost a heads up about Zephyrian firepower. But it did work, which means we get to live to see another Tuesday. Morrison nodded, then paused. Sir? What are we going to tell Command about all the unauthorized modifications to the station? Rick grinned. Morrison, I think after today, Command is going to be very interested in Kowalski's unauthorized modifications. In fact, I suspect we're about to become a model for defensive installations throughout human space. And the gift basket incident? We're going to request a formal apology and probably start an interspecies diplomatic protocol about appropriate welcome gifts. I'm thinking we suggest they stick to nice cards in the future. As if summoned by their conversation, Kowalski appeared on the bridge, wiping her hands on a grease-stained rag and looking supremely satisfied with herself. So, she said without preamble, how much trouble are we in for the weapons modifications? Well, technically we're probably violating about 60 different regulations, Rick replied. On the other hand, We just prevented an interstellar incident and accidentally started what might be the most successful first contact in human history. I'm thinking Command is going to be too busy giving us medals to worry about paperwork violations. Kowalski grinned. Good, because I've got some ideas for the reactor that I've been wanting to try. Kowalski? Yes, sir? Whatever you're thinking, run it by me first. We've had enough surprises for one day. Will do, sir. But just so you know, I think I can boost our power output by another 30% if I... Kowalski. Right, memo first, got it. As his chief engineer wandered off to presumably plan more creative violations of physics, Rick settled back into his command chair and reflected on the day's events. When he'd woken up that morning, he'd been the commander of an undermanned research outpost on the edge of nowhere, dealing with boredom and bureaucratic exile. Now he was the commander of what was apparently being hailed as the most heavily defended installation in human space, the architect of a new interspecies alliance, and quite possibly the man who had just redefined how the galaxy thought about human military capabilities. Not bad for a Tuesday. The communications array chimed, and Morrison looked up from his station with the expression of someone who had learned to be very wary of unexpected communications. Sir, we're receiving a priority message from Colonial Defense Command. Already, news travels fast. Apparently the whole engagement was picked up by a merchant vessel that relayed it to the nearest communication hub. It's been broadcasting across the core worlds for the past hour. Rick sighed. What's the message say? Morrison read from his display. Commander Barnes, you are ordered to remain at your current position and provide a full briefing on the defensive modifications to Delta 7. Engineering teams are being dispatched to study and potentially replicate your setup across the frontier. Also, Admiral Hoffman wants to know if you're interested in a promotion and transfer to strategic defense planning. Rick stared at the message for a long moment. Strategic defense planning was exactly the kind of important high-profile assignment that he'd thought his career was moving away from when he'd been exiled to Delta 7. Sir? Morrison prompted. Send a reply, Rick said finally. Tell them I'm honored by the offer, but I think I'll stay put for now. Someone needs to keep an eye on our new Zephyrian friends. And besides... He looked around the bridge, at Morrison bent over his communications array, at the displays showing Kowalski's creative engineering solutions, at the tactical grid that had gone from standard defensive measures to something that resembled a technological fever dream. Besides, I'm curious to see what we can accomplish in another 3 years. Morrison grinned as he started composing the response. Should I mention the cultural exchange program? Definitely mention the cultural exchange program. And Morrison? Yes, sir? Add a request for a bigger entertainment budget. If we're going to be hosting Zephyrian comedians, we're going to need better facilities. Will do, sir. Anything else? Rick looked out at the starfield beyond the station, where the space that had recently been filled with hostile alien warships was now empty except for the usual scatter of distant stars and the occasional navigation beacon. Somewhere out there, Kethavar was probably explaining to his superiors how a routine arrest had turned into the most embarrassing military engagement in Zephyrian history. And somewhere else, merchant vessels were spreading the story of how 47 humans had faced down an entire battle fleet and emerged victorious. It was, Rick reflected, going to make for one hell of a story. The kind of story that would be told in taverns and academy classrooms for decades to come. The kind of story that might just change how the galaxy thought about humanity. And it had all started with an exotic tropical sphere. Actually, Morrison, add one more thing to that message. Sir? Tell Command that our next diplomatic gift basket is going to include instructions. Detailed instructions. With pictures. Morrison laughed as he added the note to their transmission. Outside the viewports, the stars continued their ancient dance, indifferent to the small dramas of the species that moved between them. But Rick had a feeling that today had been one of those days when the universe shifted, just slightly, in a new direction. And honestly, he was looking forward to seeing where it led. After all, it was only Tuesday. The week was just getting started. 3 months later, the Delta 7 incident would become required reading at every military academy in human space. The cultural exchange program between humans and Zephyrians would lead to the first interspecies comedy tour, featuring acts that somehow managed to make jokes about tentacles acceptable as long as they were delivered with proper cultural sensitivity. And Chief Petty Officer Lisa Kowalski would be promoted to Head of Advanced Engineering Solutions, a new department created specifically to harness her particular brand of creative problem-solving. But Commander Rick Barnes remained at Delta 7, where he continued to serve as humanity's unofficial ambassador to anyone else who might mistake boredom for weakness. The gift basket incident was officially resolved with a formal apology and the establishment of the Galactic Diplomatic Gift Protocol, which Rick privately considered his greatest achievement. After all, preventing wars was important, But preventing wars caused by misunderstood exotic spheres? That was the kind of legacy a man could be proud of. The end.